right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm the Director of the Center for Data Innovation. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Data for Development, Powering Evidence-Based International Aid with Mobile Technology. So for those of you that don't know, the Center for Data Innovation, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank where we explore how policymakers can support data-driven innovation to advance important economic and social benefits. And today, the questions we're really exploring here are how are these benefits reaching the international development sector, and perhaps more importantly, how can government agencies, NGOs, and others who are working in this space take advantage of the new opportunities to collect and use data to improve the effectiveness of international aid, especially around the use of mobile technology. And then what we'll eventually be getting to on this panel conversation is what should policymakers be doing in addition to support these efforts. So before we begin, just a few very brief logistics. First, so everyone knows, this event is being recorded and webcast. For those of you who are joining us online via the webcast, you're welcome to participate using the hashtag data innovation. At the end of this discussion, we're going to have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So if you're here in the room, we'll have a roaming mic, but if you're participating remotely, you can also ask questions via Twitter. So there's a lot I want us to get into, so I just want to jump into the conversation. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists. Starting here on my left, we have Siobhan Green, who's the CEO of Sanjera. To her left is Catherine Hyatt, a technical advisor with FHI 360's MSTAR project. Sean Martin McDonald, who's the CEO of Frontline SMS. Samia Melham, who is the lead policy officer in the World Bank's Transport and ICT Global Practice. And at the far end of the table, Vivian Ransom is the senior program manager of the Development Informatics team in the U.S. Global Development Lab at USAID. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And to begin, I want to just pose a question to the panel. I want us to start the conversation by talking about where we are today. When you look at, all of you are working on a variety of different programs, how are you seeing mobile technologies being deployed in the field right now? And in particular, what parts of the program lifecycle are you seeing the biggest impact? So actually, why don't we start at the end and we'll work down. Thanks.
It's on, or do you push? Oh, it's on. I think what we're seeing in the field right now is actually a very interesting deployment of mobile technology and mobile data across the program cycle. So I think one of the key features that you're seeing, particular concentration in monitoring and evaluation, but you've really seen a lot of exploration across the program cycle and a lot of different uses. Whereas only a few years ago, mobile technology was trumpeted for social good. Now you're seeing it focus in on sectors, you're seeing it dive into rural tech. I think where we're trying to, where our team at USAID is really focusing in on is the range of technology application, from being technology as the solution to technology supplementing the solution to technology monitoring the solution, is an interesting range for us. And what we like to focus on is not necessarily technology as a solution or technology led, but focusing on the value creation. And so in our work, we're really looking at how are we completing the actual data use, and more specifically, are we using it to really focus that data on pulling information from community level to make sure that that impact is being completed, that there is a feedback loop, and we're not just extracting the data and information, and that we're actually creating these abilities to connect policymakers with frontline workers across sectors and with communities.
And I want to get into as many specifics as we can on this panel. So maybe you can give us an example of a kind of a prime example of where you see that feedback loop working.
Absolutely. So currently in the Global Development Lab, a number of teams have been deployed in the recovery efforts in West Africa after the Ebola epidemic. What we're seeing there, what we saw during the response itself was a noted lack of development, and I'm sure Sean can speak to this later. What we've tried to do in the recovery is focus on what happened there. There were proliferation of systems across the region. There were international actors that were being deployed without any knowledge of what other actors were deploying and using. And so as a result, you were pulling in data, but it wasn't coordinated, it was duplicative. And so you weren't able to really hone in on a picture and agree across the definitions of the data that you were pulling. In the recovery efforts, there's been a big focus on what was the fallout, what actually worked, and what are the governing mechanisms that we put in place in the aftermath to make sure that in the next public health crisis, humanitarian disaster, that we're building a more resilient governance structure that says when we come in, we have a clear landscape of what are the systems that we use current systems, create interoperability in order to not invest in the same areas, and then to make sure that the data is not just being pulled in order to enter into sit reps for WHO, but that frontline community health workers are actually able to signal we're out of protective equipment. We are seeing these symptoms, we don't know how to properly diagnose Ebola or Lassa fever, and that you're able to then say, okay, we have trained community volunteers in this area, we can deploy them, we can push out training modules for other areas that are starting to see a spike in certain occurrences. And so being able to deploy resources where they're needed instead of using them to just blanket a broad region with a system that may or may not be pulling the right information.
Samuel, let me turn to you. Obviously, you see a lot of different programs. Can you speak to that same question?
Sure, and we see similar things to what Vivian just described. As you know, the World Bank lends money to developing countries, and we have a project cycle of 3 stages. The preparation of the project, which typically takes a year, far too long, but we're trying to cut that. The implementation, which is 5 years, and then the evaluation, which takes around 6 months to a year. And in all these stages, we are seeing the whole data revolution take place within our own processes, but also with our clients. Our clients are typically ministers of ICTs, ministers of development, economic growth in these countries where we are involved. And more we're partnering with the private sector actors such as mobile operators to be able to do exactly what Vivian said, to not create more data sources, to not have that proliferation, but kind of consolidate, use standards, and offer something that could be reused for whatever comes after us, after our project. And oftentimes we collaborate with the other organizations like USAID. I'll give you an example. For instance, in Rwanda, we have through a e-Rwanda project that finished 4 years ago, we have helped create a mobile app to collect information around markets for agriculture. And it started in the beginning with around 55 markets, around 100 commodities that were tracked every day, daily, 5 days a week in these markets. And that created a lot of data, obviously. And after our project ended, USAID took that over. I don't know if you know that, but this is one of the greatest untold stories, and continued to nurture and grow the system, which expanded to much more commodities than agriculture, to things like soap, like cooking oil and other staples. And it kind of became a de facto eBay for that country. It's still being used. We're now trying to use the database created for big data analysis on the price changes over the last 5 years. But what is the lesson from this? Just to make it an example, we help employ hundreds of young people who were the data collectors. We had one mobile app that was propagated everywhere. And through the project we either subsidized acquisition of the handset or just had a grant, donated it. We donated a lot of mobile handsets to farmers, to cooperatives, etc. And we really tried to nurture that one application, which was a mobile app that was based on a big database sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture, and deploy it to all the different districts of the country. That was what I call a good practice. Oftentimes we don't have that. Oftentimes we have 20 such applications being deployed by one or two different providers. They don't talk to one another. The standards used are very different. The way a tomato is coded in one is very different than in the other 19. So you cannot have the big picture for one simple application, which is really monitoring of the prices of agricultural staples in one country. So I think we've learned a lot from that experience. It takes a lot of mobilization, a lot of negotiation, really involving all the parties in that project from the very beginning, and we're starting to get better at that in different countries.
Thank you. Sean, let me turn to you. I think it would be helpful for at least some of the people in the room. I know we have a variety of backgrounds. Maybe you can start by introducing what your company does and the very innovative product there. And then perhaps talk about some of the use cases specifically around this where you see the most impact.
Absolutely. So I run a company called Frontline SMS. What we do is we build tools that make it easier to manage and automate and structure the kinds of communications that people have over text messaging. And I think it's valuable so our tool suite works in a wide variety of contexts. It's been around for a decade, used in over 200 countries. So we've seen a lot of the variation. And I think that when we talk about some of these concepts, it's useful to pull a couple of the pieces apart. One being the difference between sort of digitization of processes generally, and then the application of mobile technology to those. So wireless infrastructure is the great innovation of mobile technology, right? The ability to deploy infrastructure in a much faster way, both at the market level and at the tower level, means you have a significant increase in the volume of data that you can move around. But what ends up happening is that value, like Vivian said, that value is totally context dependent. And so when you're looking at how is it that we drive impact, how do we turn to evidence-based approaches to this, it's what data has value in context, and then how do you essentially make that data available on demand. And so for us, a lot of our approach to context has been that we as a central actor, as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., are not going to be the best judge of what information is valuable in what process and what content. So we make tools for people who do. And so the idea is if we can work with small to medium-sized enterprises, national governments, local community radio stations, those are the people who are going to be able to decide what information, what interaction is most valuable to achieve their own objective. So here in the United States, even we're working with legal aid providers. So lots of people who get access to legal aid are not people who are using, augmented reality apps or the cutting edge, and are very often very difficult to reach and live in rural and distributed areas. And rural areas are pretty similar in many parts of the world. So communicating with them via SMS, giving them actionable reminders, the ability to create appointments, the ability to do client care and follow-up, those kinds of interactions are valuable in healthcare, they're valuable in agriculture, they're valuable in legal services. We're working with the government of India and an NGO called Landesa in Odisha. We've helped them basically help digitize their land titling process all the way from the beginning survey to the actual distribution process. So they have a distributed network of people who go out into a wide range of communities, are looking for land titles that are up to 40 years old, trying to ask the questions that update the underlying information, report them to a centralized database, and then they submit claims on behalf of people who have never had legal title to their own land. And those people are kept up to date using text messaging, using Frontline throughout the process. So we've seen dramatic increases in confidence in the process, quality of relationship with those government processes, but also reduction in costs and reduction in time to title. And all of those things, we're both making the process faster and more efficient. We are increasing the faith that people have in that relationship with that institution, and we're overall kind of digitizing, creating a lasting artifact that will help hopefully improve the processes in an ongoing way. So those are legal aid here in the United States and land titling in Bhubaneswar are actually remarkably similar from a communication structure perspective. But that's a lot of the sort of underlying thought behind what Frontline does.
Great, thank you. Kathy, can you talk a little bit about the InStar project and kind of what?
Yeah. Okay. So the MSTAR project is a USA project which is housed within FHI 360. So MSTAR stands for the Mobile Solutions Technical Assistance and Research Project. We have three key areas. So we have digital inclusion, so that this includes looking at women's inclusion and making sure that mobile projects and the work that we do includes gender as a focus, digital literacy, and then our biggest stream is probably digital financial services, and then we have real-time data, a team that works heavily with the development informatics team at USA. So these are our key areas. On the first question, I'd say that in the years that I've worked in this industry, you've seen a real shift from the beginning where it was much more of a reaction, a push-pull function where NGOs had heard about mobile, they wanted to be using this, they thought it would be more efficient, and they were literally just pushing information at beneficiaries and then extracting it, maybe doing a questionnaire or asking them about how they took their medicine or when they liked to go to town, just to sort of understand behaviours. But it was never really involved the user, and in some ways it was quite exploitative because it never focused on the user and their behaviours and what was actually useful, and was often very confusing. I'd say at the same time for many years, and there still is, there's a lot of hype around different technologies. So, mobile was the first piece of hype where you would have people very excited about the prospect of, NGOs very excited about the prospect of using mobile phones, and then it was smartphones, and then it was tablets, and then it's sensors and it's drones and it's the next shiny thing. And now I think I'm seeing that we have a bit more of a shift back to reality and what is actually sustainable in this field. And that means greater collaboration with other NGOs working in the community, the government, which for a long time I think was seen as a partner that required a very heavy lift and was bureaucratic and took a long time to do anything. But there's now, I think that organisations are starting to understand that sustainability depends on partnering and integrating with government much of the time. And more so than that, collaborating with the user and understanding what would be useful, what does the user want, what are their behaviours, do they even have a mobile phone, do they have electricity, all of these key points. So I think that it's a healthy shift, and it's probably quite an organic curve to huge excitement back to a reality check, and now we're maybe at the start of the next curve, upward spike, which is focused on more sensible and more realistic growth in the sector.
Thank you. Siobhan, I know you're the fifth after this, but I also know you've worked on a lot of really interesting projects. So let me invite you to respond to the first question.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I do want to reiterate what other people have said. In all of our lives, technology has been integrated into how we do business, how we get here through GPS, through how we remember to get to this meeting because it's on my calendar, how I got the invitation. This is not an unusual situation. This is pretty much the way the world is going worldwide. I was in Uganda for 5 weeks, and pretty much all the Ministry of Health people I worked with had pretty good phones. You could get a cheap Chinese smartphone for under $50, and they were texting and emailing and sending me stuff on Google Mail, on Gmail, instead of their ministry accounts, which was interesting. As technology is becoming more embedded in our lives, and this is across every sector, technology is becoming more embedded in development. We are technology partners for implementing partners in the US government, so we're usually not the primes, we're usually the subs, and we work across all the different sectors. Pretty much everything these days has a data component to it, and if it has a data component to it, it will have a technology component. And mobile technology is one of the major ways that you can get, as Sean pointed out, the mobile, wireless, in my pocket, I need this information right now. So I do like the fact that we're switching away from IT for IT's sake, the shiny, cool thing that's gonna solve all our problems, to another tool in our box to help solve some of these really challenging problems. That said, just like you would never do a public health project without having a public health specialist on your team, I strongly recommend that there never be a project that has a strong data component and a strong technology component that doesn't have technology specialists. Because, as you said before, the proliferation and the standards, these are simple problems that with some thinking about technology before you start really can lead to incredibly strong benefits. And my second point is that I want us to separate platform from data. Platform is the thing that you use to collect the data. It can be a website, it can be an Excel spreadsheet, it can be a piece of paper. The data is what we really care about at the end of the day. The platform has to be good, it has to be solid, it has to be secure. But the data lives beyond the platform. You might have maybe 5 years with the platform before you probably have to trash it and start again with something new, because that's how fast technology works. But the data should live. We should be able to see 5, 10, 15, 20, and hopefully some point 50 years of data. And that needs to outlive whatever technology infrastructure we're putting in now. And then finally, just to say, we're really starting in a world of data-driven decision-making. Here in this country, where pretty much you have broadband connectivity in your pocket, we're only starting, especially in the US government, the NGO space, we're having a hard time managing our own data. We don't necessarily have tools that we need to give us the information that we need. We're still starting that process. In other parts of the world where the capacity for all the stages of a data lifecycle, from collection to validation and verification, analysis, and then actually usage, all of those different stages require different capacities and different infrastructures. A mobile piece of software is not going to solve those capacity building issues. It's not going to solve the fact that there's no legal infrastructure protecting the rights of individuals whose data you're collecting, or there's no legal requirement to share that data with the public. When you don't have a Freedom of Information Act, as most countries, for example, in Africa do not, then the ability for a public to actually access that data is very limited, even if they have the technology. Even if we have an API, a mobile phone, an application, if there's no legal infrastructure, then you can't get it. So I just want to say that I'm really excited about where we are as an industry, in that we're embedding more and more into development problems. But I do also want to say that we can't just pretend that the problems are not a technology problem. They're really a capacity, policy, infrastructure, and sometimes financial problem. The technology, honestly, is the easiest part.
So I want to have a lot of kind of respond to this. Let me maybe broaden the question a little bit more and ask, so we've seen a number of examples of where it's being applied today. My question is really, given limited resources, what are the short-term opportunities? What's the low-hanging fruit? I mean, we talked about there's a whole life cycle of these projects you can use. You can talk about data for empowering the end user. You can talk about it for empowering the NGO, or for better fundraising or for better program management. But where should we be putting our focus right now? Where's the kind of biggest opportunity in the short term that we should be focusing on? It looks like you want to respond, so go ahead.
So as I said, I just came back from Uganda. I was there for an evaluation on a PEPFAR funded project, working with the Ministry of Health on building their monitoring and evaluation capacity in country. And so some of the things that we saw that were just really so obvious. Things like a data set published in an API of all the districts with GPS coordinates. There is one, it's in Excel, and it's sitting on a hard drive. That alone, that piece of data alone, put out in an open API format, and this is Uganda. Uganda has tremendous IT capacity in the country. We don't need to hire somebody in another country to do it, maybe a little more guidance on what exactly, how to shape it and so forth. But there's a lack of capacity around using the data that's already being collected and making it more publicly available. And in some cases, we're talking about standards, having things structured is already better than unstructured. having it structured in consistent ways that you can then combine is even better than that. But again, oftentimes people will use these standards, if you publish something like a list of, well, here's an example, a list of all the foreign assistance framework and all of its indicators in Open API. Boom, we already have it in Excel. And that way they can be pulled into all these different software systems all around the world today. And most people are just pretty much lazy. They'll just use the existing standard and have to create their own. So that's where I see the low-hanging fruit. We already have collecting all this data. Let's make it more accessible in ways that are interoperable.
And so, I keep presenting that. How do we do that? I mean, do we need, USAID to have an open data bounty program? Do we need to have, some kind of focused effort? Do we need, how would you actually solve that problem?
Oh, absolutely. So things like, and I think USAID is actually doing a lot of this. So I don't mean to say that they shouldn't, but I think having those technology people involved in a lot of these projects to say, hold on a second, I need to be part of a larger community practice, just like the child survival community has a community practice where they talk about child survival issues. There's we build a community practice around ICT so that we can say, hey, I got this API, let's share it. Hey, I want to build this API. Do you use the ISO numbers? Well, I actually use, something else. So it's a way for us to communicate. USAID, the Open Data team, has actually started this, but as we've known from technology, you can't just throw up something on a website and say, go. And I think, the MSTAR project is a great example of where USAID is putting a lot of investment to say, we need to be building these communities, and we need to be basically sharing information and having best practices. But also there's a little bit of a whip cracking. And so having the open data policy, I think, was incredibly in the DDL, required to be published in DDL, is a great first step.
Can you explain the acronym?
Absolutely. The development data library, this is something, what I love about this is that it clearly recognizes that the data that you collect in Party Development Initiative is an asset. It's an asset that's been paid for by the US government. This asset needs to be protected. It needs to be maintained. It's not necessarily supposed to be publicly available. Some of it should be, some of it shouldn't be. But it's not an afterthought. And so that to me is very powerful because it also means that you can actually use program funds to create and protect that asset. And then on top of that, then there needs to be that accountability feature of rewarding the people who are doing a really great job with it and maybe embarrassing people who are not. So we're at the beginning of the stage, and I think we're starting to have a lot of the right pieces.
Great, thank you.
So I want to start by pushing back on the question a little bit. I think there are a lot of good points that were raised by Siobhan. I don't know that we go for the low-hanging fruit. I don't think the low-hanging fruit is not quite as valuable. What we should be doing is looking at the opportunity. We've reached this point where we have technology, we are pulling in data, we're not using it. I think what we're doing right now is avoiding this question of coming back and looking back at our internal structures and processes, whether that's government, whether that's large implementing partners or our partner governments in the field. We need to look at the broken processes that throwing technology at don't fix in and of themselves. There's a real temptation to layer on or build a mobile or digitized version of a broken paper process, and that really doesn't fix it. What we are struggling with in our program cycle is not only how do you apply it across the program cycle, but how do you actually adjust your programming so that it can use high frequency data and feedback loops. We're struggling to really answer the questions that the data is now making possible. And that takes a lot of time. That is high hanging fruit to me. And it's worth the investment to go back and question all the messiness of what are the legal implications of opening up data, what are our responsibilities to protect our partner governments and citizens, and who owns the data that we collect and we build in platforms. To Siobhan's point, I think that there is really good progress and there's potential in open data, but there's even on our own team within the Global Development Lab, there's a raging debate over what is our stance on open data. It's not that we don't believe in it, but open data on its own does not create better development outcomes. So should we be focusing on building the APIs and opening up the data, making it available, should we be focusing on the capacity of governments to actually use that data to drive better service to citizens? I think that's an area that we're really interested in hearing more from the rest of from the panelists. But where should we be headed after? What does open data do for us?
Sean.
Yeah, so I want to jump in and agree with a lot of the spirit of what's been said, but disagree with some of the mechanics. I think that there's a ton of low-hanging fruit, and a lot of what we look at are indicator definitions, right? And so whether that's the DDL or whether that's an incredibly rich set of performance indicators that exist in almost every industry in the world already, regardless of its development sort of relationship. Like a doctor's office can tell you, many doctor's offices can tell you what drives revenue for them, what gets them a lot of great patient outcomes. Medicine has a very well researched set of indicators about what kinds of behaviors lead to improved outcomes. So I would say the low-hanging fruit is let's optimize for the definitions that we have. Let's optimize for the things that industries have already developed as very clear performance indicators to win just quick efficiencies there. There are tons of those in logistics. There are tons of those in informatics. There are tons of those in simply like the power of an appointment app. You'd be amazed at the efficiencies you can gain just by reducing no-shows. We've seen inoculation rates go from 65% to 98% just on the back of text message reminders. And this isn't because I sell a text messaging platform. I do, for what it's worth, sell a text messaging platform. But the point is that no matter how that reminder is delivered, a combination of a personal relationship with your healthcare provider and a fairly convenient way to be reminded of your commitments actually has huge impact. And that's true in the finance sector, that's true in the healthcare sector, and that's true in the legal services sector, among many others. So like those mechanics, low-hanging fruit, very, very easy. Two quick other points. One is when we talk about standards, when we talk about data structures, these are governance problems. And they're not, data may be forever. The definitions that we apply to that data, or the context that we apply to that data, are definitely not forever. And so the big things that I spend a lot of time looking at, whether it's sort of like I-80 or open data sets, or like let's just throw all of the data in the world together and see what kind of similarities we can find and then form proxy indicators from that, like I find is a very problematic approach, because anytime you attach a market value, which I think at least this side of the table does, attach a market value to your ability to perform against indicators, to a standard, you now have a problem where the standard, whoever owns that standard, has a market position. And having a market position is a really valuable thing. So I don't know if any of you read XKCD. It's a web comic. It's hysterical if you're a nerd like me. But one of the best ones is on standards. And it's sort of problem. We have 14 standards competing for the same piece of data. Solution, I know, I'll invent a new standard. Problem, we have 15 competing standards to solve the same problem, right? So it's when we're talking about how it is that we're building data, whether it's open or closed, whether it's structured or unstructured, the things that I always worry about, and I think this is what you're talking about with process definition, is how are we operationalizing the way that standard gets used, and how are we policing, for lack of a better term, the definitions there. And then the really last quick thing is that the phrase is information is power, not data is power, and I'd love to think that that was a time thing, that brings it a little bit back to the value of context. And I think that there's a conception in the field, or conception in many spaces, that by opening data, we are inherently making it more equitable. And in fact, what we are very often doing is we're applying market forces to the distribution and the contextualization of that data. So what that means is we're now intermediating a whole series of new market-centered actors on the way that previously publicly funded or publicly supported or at least publicly accountable data sets got used. And it's not that that's inherently a bad thing or a good thing. There are a lot of gray areas in between. But it is something to say that the journey from releasing something via an API to the types of, to being accessible and useful to the types of people that development interventions target is a long path. And it's a non-trivial thing to suggest that open data somehow results inherently and implicitly in the delivery of that value to those populations.
Samia, and then
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what has been said before. For us, the low-hanging fruit in our project is really reuse. Reuse whatever has worked before. And it sounds so simple, yet it's so difficult to implement. What Shobani said on the geo-tagging of district, villages, towns, I see that in every one of our projects. For every one of our projects, whether it's health, agriculture, or governance, somehow there is a database or a spreadsheet starting from scratch each time. And not only in English, but in Swahili, and depending on the local language, maybe in 10 dialects, to refer to the exact same entity that was mapped 10 years ago and is sitting somewhere on somebody's hard drive. So, and I often wonder about this. This is such an easy thing. Why can't we reuse? Another typical investment we do is investing in creating charts of accounts for all the government systems, tax, customs, you name it, education. And again, within the same organization, let's say our organization, different sectors, different global practice, hire different entities to do exactly the same thing. And whereas this may be great temporarily for the project or for employment, on the long term, it's a bit what you said, Vivian, it's proliferation of a lot of small things that are not complete, that are at a district level or at a province level, and that are not adopted and rolled out nationwide. And I think that's the biggest thing to counteract the low-hanging fruit. And I have two possibilities that I've seen working. The first one is through our procurement, because we don't do these things ourselves. We procure it to many contractors, large, medium, and small. Through our procurement document, make it very clear that we're looking for X, the open standards, the API, the reuse, and really more proactively put together all the actors that have worked in that specific country, in that specific sector. And you'd be surprised how many of our people respond to that, even though the project has ended and they're no longer under our contract, they would come back, the local actors, and they would share the information because they have the passion to see their project succeed or roll out. The second element is, we talked a lot about open data, and it's a terrific entry point, and I've seen a lot of things move dramatically and change in a better way under the open data movement, if you will. But as long as it's not really in the legislation, as long as it's not enacted, as long as the government, alongside with the Freedom of Information Act, we don't have an open government act, we don't have a data sharing act amongst the different siloed agencies, it's very limited and it's short-lived. And then everybody gets disappointed because there's so much hope and expectations around the open data movement. And last but not least, constant communication about this to the citizens who are our biggest champions, and understanding that many of them would not understand the very scientific aspects of data or standards, or what you mentioned, Sean, the different 15, 16 possibilities of different standards around the same entity. How to make this understandable, digestible, and use the citizens as the champions of that reuse and scale up that I'm talking about.
And let me stay with you for a minute. You mentioned before about how World Bank basically contracts out, especially with local data collectors. So you're basically creating jobs. But obviously, in the data lifecycle, it's more the collection, it's also the analysis, dissemination. Are you moving into that space in terms of kind of thinking about how you empower the local communities to have the capabilities to do the analysis? And so it's not just that they're out there sending data back to Washington or wherever, but that the data is in that full loop, and that they're the ones that are helping execute that loop.
You're absolutely right. And oftentimes we are kind of accused, okay, you're creating all these open data, you're publishing all our data sets, but nobody in the country is benefiting of it. Are you doing that so that the US or France can use this and create value without the spillover effect? And we really need to work on the ecosystem. And some parts of the ecosystem are easier to prepare than others. For instance, data scientists, database managers, the whole computer science background around data. You really need to work with local universities. You want to make sure they have good programs for database management, for data scientists, for statisticians. And a lot of times this is not done by the ICT folks. is done by the folks working on higher education or higher education reform. We've done very well the quick wins in that, the hackathons, the data journalism, the small 1 week boot camps where you train developers and programmers. But these are people who are already in the know. Are we doing enough to really expand that knowledge to all parts of society? I would say we are, where we have projects, but it's a slow process. And probably slower than we would wish, because it involves a big machinery of education, of employment, and of culture also. Because oftentimes, and this is perhaps my perception, governments are not ready for all that big data analysis. It creates so much accountability, so much need for follow-up. Governments, even though the most sincere, they're not yet built for it. So I think preparing governments also to deal with the analysis of the data generated, the follow-up, the gaps, frankly, the gaps between all this great stuff we collected, the clear course of action and limited actions because of budget, skills, etc. I think that's the toughest point.
Thank you.
I would just say that after, the last 10 or so years of ICT for development, we've talked very frequently about the low-hanging fruit and we've pillaged the tree. I'm not so sure that there is a ton of low-hanging fruit left. But if there is, it would be in collaboration. I mean, we kind of confuse tech with this quick win. We think that technology is very efficient, but actually this is a long game. This is not really about quick wins, and I think we need to be a bit more invested in, beyond the project life cycle.
Can I ask you on that? So if not quick wins, what if we rephrase it to what's the biggest ROI? So maybe it's not easy, but it has.
I would say it's collaboration. I would say it's starting to, understand who else is doing it. It's the hardest bit, which is, most NGOs, most donors are fairly proprietary around how they collect data, what they do. But if we want this to be effective in the long run, we need to work together, and that means, giving up a little bit of our sovereignty in a way, and being able to collaborate with other donors. We're seeing this more and more. I know USAID has partnered with DFID and Gates and CEDA and found Dial. So we're starting to see this shift there. But I'm not sure. I was recently in Liberia, and there's been a lot of hype around digital identity, and this is going to be the next quick one. This is low-hanging fruit. And the reality is, within the government, there is no legal framework for privacy of information. There's the legalese doesn't exist. So there's this barrier. There is a complete technical barrier where people are not necessarily equipped within the Ministry of Information and Communications. There's a lot of confusion around digital identity. So the technology, as someone said, I'm not sure who, technology is the easy part. That's fine. We can come in and bring biometric tools. That's not a problem. But if the legal framework isn't there, if the capacity isn't there, then we've got, there are other hurdles that need to be crossed. And it's not that they shouldn't be, it's just that we need to look beyond the low-hanging fruit. And I think that if we want to be sustainable about efforts, we have to start collaborating better.
So one of the projects that you had mentioned that MSAR is working on is around using data to increase gender equality in developing countries. So can you talk a little bit about how those projects are working, especially in terms of collaboration, and what else should we participate?
Yeah, definitely. So we're in the final stages of developing a survey toolkit to measure the gap in gender use of ICTs. So we know that there is a significant gap, and women are less likely to own and use mobile phones and devices. The GSMA has, every 5 years or so, has produced a report, the Connected Women team, looking at access and usage, which USAID actually funded. And so this is a very expensive piece of research to produce every 5 years or so, and the idea is people need this information on a local level, on a regional level, on a state level very frequently. So by developing a sort of a standardized set of indicators based off GSMA standards, ITU, CGAP, looking at mobile usage, mobile internet usage, digital financial services, M-Agri, and providing this questionnaire that people can, the survey that people can go and measure this information. But because the indicators are all standardized, it can then be kind of pulled together and compared. So, like Samia said, oftentimes this data is already existing, but we're just, we have to reuse. We need to show that we're a new project. We need to set our own standards, even if it's exactly the same data as that has been collected before. But the aim of this toolkit, the survey toolkit, is to collect the data in a standardized way and have it in a central database so it can be used by other actors, can be grown and expanded on. Of course, this depends on whether the other actors are prepared to share that data, and this is feeds back to that question of collaboration, which everyone talks about and no one actually does.
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, sorry. There are two things that I think just come out of what you said, which are really important, among many others, of course. One is that actually the legal framework in Liberia for privacy of data absolutely exists. It's not implemented, but ECOWAS, the regional... Right. So ECOWAS has built all of their privacy protections on Convention 108 from the EU. So they all have all of the legwork done for local data protection authorities with some of the most sweeping mandates, that exist in law. And what's fascinating about the Liberian context is exactly the one that you're talking about, which is that essentially all of the sort of headline grabbing work was getting Liberia to the point of ratifying it, and none of the headline work goes into the implementation of that project. And I think that, to the point that you're saying where everybody needs their project to have a new thing, I don't want to beat the low hanging fruit thing to death, but we have invented solutions to many problems, but we have not distributed those solutions to all of the places where those problems exist. And so we keep coming upon problems that have been solved in other people's projects and other people's, work, but we don't ever take them to the sort of scale of solution. And I think it's a collaboration problem, but it is also a funding the non-invention part of technology influence work. And it's the distribution and implementation, whether you're thinking about it as capacity building or collaboration or market models for sustainability or monitoring and evaluation. These are all components of taking something which we have proven one time in one place or 100 places, but recognizing that this problem exists in a million places, and that the funding cycle that supports that part sort of doesn't really exist. And there are interesting questions about what role who plays in that sort of space, but the pathway between development-funded invention and market-adopted distribution, I think that there's a big gap there. And I think that's one of the, but it's completely not sexy work. And so it's just it's really hard to write a straight-faced proposal to an innovation program for we did this once, but now we need to do it a million more times.
And I just wanted to say also that, first of all, thank you so much for the work that you guys are doing on gender, because we've looked for data across so many times on gender access and usage, and other than 5-year studies, it's what we use as a proxy is the Gender Equality Index. That's actually the best proxy you have, because what we find is that gender access to ICTs follows equality rather than actual distribution in country. So it's kind of our proxy that we use. But the other thing too, to kind of reiterate, I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but I would say approaches that I recommend is that focus on data reuse. We're running a project actually right now funded by USAID Global Health called the Accelerator Behaviors Project, which is a very large data component around EPCMD, ending preventable child maternal death. We're not we're not going out there and doing projects. We're using data that implementing partners are collecting and coming from the DHS and coming from World Bank and other places to provide portfolio management tools for missions to be able to see across their portfolios how they're doing in these different sectors. Now we just started, we're still working a lot of questions around access to data and who's going to give us access to it. But I'll tell you, there's nothing like actually taking disparate data sets and trying to turn them into a tool that can be then used to analyze to really feel like standards are really a good thing. And to make you want to go back and scream at people and say, but if you just put it in this, if you just changed it ever so slightly, it would have been in the international. And that data reuse honestly needs to be, I believe, something that's required. That you're not going to go out and capture data all over again. That you're going to use data that's already in existence from other donors in some cases. And then you, at the end, you're going to be required to provide the data that you've produced to the government, to your donor, to other people for data reuse. It is a requirement and expectation. Because if you know your data is going to be looked at and reused, the chances that it's going to be higher quality are much, much greater. And that you're going to think about how you actually capture it and maybe not capture quite all those data points that you're never actually going to analyze.
And I'd just say to that, the reality is that most of these projects are funded by USA.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the same donor, we're talking about the same taxpayer money that we're just wasting. I mean, it's terrible.
I want you to respond, but I also wanted to bring it back to kind of the larger question, which is, kind of going forward, using data to address gender inequality and disparities. What should be the primary focus? What are you guys thinking about doing? What else should we be talking to policymakers about focusing on?
Absolutely. So I first want to echo, I heard that pop up and I was like, I see a common point of conflict here. And I can't defend that. First, I can't support strongly what Catherine said about collaboration. And I think I didn't mean to beat up on the low-hanging fruit. It certainly exists. I think ROI is a good way to put it, in that all of the low-hanging fruit, in order to really get that value from it, it all goes back to these much harder human behavior change problems that have been really persistent issues in how we are taking advantage of a lot of what technology is enabling. I think my ears perk up when I hear the phrase that technology is easy, because it may be in terms of just building. I am not a programmer, and so I will take your word for it that it is easy, but the problem is that it comes with a lot of baggage. Even watching the software engineers on my own team fight out how the approach to architecture should be, not a conversation that I really want to venture into. And so to them, technology is not easy because it comes with these human issues of, I believe it should be done this way, and this has broad implications for how standards are decided and how we set up the data so that it can live beyond the platform, because it often doesn't because of the way that it was set up in the first place. And so I do think collaboration is one of those next great hurdles. Something that is encouraging to me is I feel like that's an area where, as policymakers, there is a lot of appetite. A lot of the themes that have been echoed across this panel are represented in the principles of digital development, which is a set of best practices and heuristics that were developed by a group of donors in the late 2000s around these themes of being user-centered and designing with the user, not at or to the user, and reusing and improving is principle 7, issues of privacy and security is principle 8. So we know these lessons, but this is where it goes back to your question of now what? We know this, reuse and improve. So why does USAID publish an mHealth compendium that has hundreds of things that work and we still reinvent the wheel? Probably not a palatable thing to say as a member of USAID, but I think what I'm trying to promote is that there are a lot of efforts within the agency to collaborate across bureaus. The lab was set up primarily as one of those pieces of, we should not be going out and pursuing our own programming, although we have areas that are very specific in terms of digital inclusion, digital financial services that are unique, but they really need to be done in tandem with the work that's happening at missions, with the work that's happening across bureaus. It takes a lot of time, and this is an area where and in our team, we see as holding a lot of promise is looking back at how that should influence our own processes and structures. Something that my team is looking into that we're actually working with MSTAR on is real-time data for adaptive management. And so this is the earlier point I made about how do we learn how to live with higher frequency data, with creating feedback loops that aren't just extractive, is to actually build that into policy levels for us, the ADS, which governs how we do development and defines the program cycle. And then the next big step is going and making sure that the how, what does that mean beyond the words of the policy, that it can be understood and used. And so that's a big focus that I've seen shift, is turning back now to our own missions to implementing partners and asking enough about if the policy's in place, then what? What are the actual tools that allow that to be used? What are the, what kind of capacity building do we need to refocus on to make sure that it's not just information that's coming back to the donor, but information that can be used by government partners, and that it's allowing implementing partners to adjust as they're doing the work rather than saying, I'm sorry, that would require a contract modification, so we won't be using that data feedback.
Right, and so, I mean, what needs to change to get to that point? Because I think that's the key part of, using data on the funding side, is how do you actually have that kind of flexibility? And I mean, it's not just a program with a problem with USAID. I mean, we see this across the entire federal government. How do we do contracting in a way that is, new and innovative and allows for the capabilities? We actually just put out an article this week. Alex Costera, who's here, wrote up about how the Department of Commerce is being really innovative with their public-private partnerships in forming new ways of doing contracting because of the fact that the old ways simply don't work. Are there more types of opportunities to kind of experiment on that side? I mean, we didn't invite a contracting officer here today. Actually, I reached out to one. I didn't hear back from him. But
It's the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
but I'd love to hear about how, and maybe not just obviously from you, but on the other side, people here on the receiving end, how would that look like on your end, and how could that look like?
So the first question on procurement, there is a lot of work that quite honestly is happening within the agency that has to be done, the conversations and the hard work of taking the time to coordinate, because every email that we send within USAID is usually copied to about 50 people. That kind of work, as long as the email backup happens, it still is required in order to drive that kind of collaboration. But I do think that there are a lot of exciting opportunities happening around procurement and other structures that have an opportunity for broader involvement. For example, we're looking into mechanisms that can be pulled from other areas of government that have shown success and that we're trying to adopt for our own uses. One mechanism that has been used with success from DARPA is called the Broad Agency Announcement, and that is an alternative approach to procurement that creates a competitive process. It bypasses the normal competitive process that is very siloed in terms of we issue this solicitation, we ask for your proposal, but we cannot talk. And 5 companies, 50 companies will bid on that without talking as well and just guessing at what the solution is. It's built more around the question of, we have a common problem, we don't know what the solution is. We invite any organization that has knowledge in the space that thinks they have an idea to come participate in a co-creation process. And understanding that it is a bit awkward because not everyone will, at the end of the day, be a part of the solution that carries forward. Can we co-create and inform the solution that can draw upon the experience by implementing partners, by other stakeholders who actually understand the space more. So there were half a dozen attempts in the last few years that launched these, several by the Global Development Lab. The number, I think there are a few dozen in place right now that are being used across the agency. It isn't a perfect process. We ran one ourselves on addressing the issue of interoperability in health information systems in West Africa, because interoperability, surprise, is an issue that should be spoken to by a number of organizations. And so it's by no means a perfect solution, but it is something that's different from what we've done before, just allowing the government to come forward as an equal partner and hearing from the expertise and the experience of partners on the ground in order to co-create a solution that that can have a better chance at adapting to what we've seen and create a little bit more flexibility in the process.
Very quickly, just to add a bit around the governance of data. At least for us at the World Bank, we're so focused on the project cycle, and we haven't been for a long time really thinking of data as a critical soft infrastructure for each one of the countries we deal with. We've had this year the World Development Report for the first time ever on the digital. It's called Digital Dividends. I have a few summaries if anybody's interested. I can send you links also. Basically what it found is what you all are saying. Technology is not a problem, it's the governance of technology, the architecture used, and really sustaining all this. So we've been toying with a few ideas, and I think it kind of echoes a bit what Vivian and Sean said earlier, is how about with the countries that want to play with us, and in that attempt to have the more holistic picture of the soft data infrastructure, start to have a very complete project where we're having data around the basic databases needed, the people. So to Catherine's point on ID, whether it's digital, the people, the land, all non-movable assets, schools, clinics, location of government buildings, once and for all, at that, point in time, mapped in a comprehensive, under a unified platform, open for most of the data unless it's very sensitive or critical to national security, and then based on that, continue the development work. And for that, we thought about how could that be done. It can only be done, as you said, Daniel, under a PPP type of arrangement. Government has a lot of that data, but the private sector, the NGOs, the people working on the ground today and in the last 10 years have a lot of that. So how can we build that from scratch with a few governments who would be takers and use that as a showcase to kind of try to improve that approach, but have it in all our client countries. So we even started to calculate the return on that particular investment. And really, if we stop reinventing the wheel and do that reuse, we see huge benefits. We're still trying to target a few countries. We haven't really had the concept very clear and very well communicated, but we're working on that under the follow-up for the World Development Report. And it would be great to, later on after this panel ends, to continue bouncing ideas and brainstorming on that.
So, do you want to?
I just wanted to push back briefly on the BAA and the devil's advocate. I mean, in theory, on paper, it's fantastic. I guess from a development perspective, from a development practitioner perspective, USAID is asking multiple development agencies to come together at their own costs and put forward their best ideas in the hope that one of them will be picked. And it's sort of like, for me, it's not organic collaboration because you're in a room, you're in a kind of a context with all of your competitors. You're trying to share with the right people and hide information from the other people. And you go home with no prize. You go home with maybe the chance that a piece of your work might show up, but maybe there's another development agency that's implementing that work. So, I mean, I love the idea of it. I just wonder how sustainable it is for development agencies to compete in that kind of mechanism.
Yeah, what can I just ask before?
Sorry, I just wanted to say.
Well, hold on.
Sorry.
How would you change it?
That's a really good question, and I don't want to be the person who's the naysayer and has no solutions. I think that there may be a sort of like a, and again, this is very off the bat, but maybe a smaller group, because I know that sometimes there's a lot of development agencies that come where everyone is going to come away with a small piece of the pie. And I don't know the logistics of how that would work, but there needs to be something in it for the development agencies if they're going to continue to invest in this process and to put forward their best ideas. So if there was maybe a smaller pre-selected group development practitioners.
Like an IQC per se,
But
or
at the same-
like one of the small group certification programs.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, and just to reiterate too, in addition to running Samjara, I'm also on the board of the Small Business Association of International Companies. Any small businesses who work in international development, you need to be part of us. We work to make small business environment more friendly at USAID and in the foreign assistance community. And we actually had the director of the lab come and talk to us about the BAAs, and we said the exact same thing. Especially with the small business community, when you're talking about maybe 10 staff, you're talking about people's time when they're not spending on billable or on business development. So, our R&D research is so, my time spent in a BAA where I want to be part of the room, I want to be part of the conversations, but what I'm really afraid of, and this has actually happened to us, where we provide a lot of ideas, innovations, and experience, and the next thing I know, a very large company or a very large NGO has walked away with our ideas, maybe promised us a little bit of work, and we never got anything out of it. So there's a lot of power issues that you really need to think about what the incentives, and get the incentives right. But sorry? It's not organic, but there is a lot of organic collaboration. I mean, I think, everyone's here. I'm not getting paid for this, anyone else? But we're part of these conversations. But we're already sort of doing this type of forum, people involved in this Society for National Development and other forums. So we have a lot of those things. Maybe we just take advantage more of those communities of practice and those places for collaboration. If that's what we're trying to get to. I don't have any other solutions.
So let me respond, but before I do, I just want everyone, we're going to open it up for audience questions in 1 moment, so I want everyone to be ready for that. If you're on Twitter and you want to submit questions, again, just use the hashtag data innovation. And so I'll let you respond. I also want to kind of broaden the question a little bit to this question of what's the role of the private sector in, working in this space, basically.
Yeah, so we started as a grant-funded organization, as a nonprofit, and then kind of built or developed into a USAID sub, and have largely, we don't have any USAID contracts now, and have largely moved kind of out of that. And now we work pretty directly with the clients that we serve. So in some ways, that's a success story. It would be awesome if it felt more like that. We're doing great, don't worry for us. But it's one of those things where if we were really happy with the market dynamics in the USAID space or in the broader development sector space, we would be a lot more focused there. It's tough, and I think that unfortunately there's a binary, right? I joked, but none of us are getting paid. And so we can all collaborate because there's no money at the end of this rainbow, right? But somebody puts money on the table, this whole room changes. And I think that that's a very, very clear binary, right? And it's one of those things where we keep trying to be where's the soft entry into a market that where we can still get the benefit of collaboration, but also the money of contracting. And there have been lots of different models. And I respect your effort. I don't know where that line is. I'm glad you were asked, not me. But one thing that I wanted to bring up, and it speaks a little bit to your comments, and a little bit to your comments earlier. We talk about technologists as a title or technology specialists, which I've used and I have good friends who use and I still love them, but it's not a thing. Understanding technology is cool, don't get me wrong, but the things that we're talking about, being a security engineer, that's not a vague term. A security engineer is someone who has a very explicit understanding of what the infrastructural and technical risks of making certain decisions are. Lawyers, I'm a lawyer, I'm sorry, but you all need more of them. And when we're having these conversations, a lawyer will tell you that some of the things we're saying don't make any sense together, right? So we keep talking about open data, and then we keep talking about local ownership of data. The thing is, you can't do both. Licensing and open is the absence of licensing. So open means that you cannot control who does what with what, right? And as someone who built open source tools for a long time, in the early 2000s, the question that you would always get is, but can terrorists use your tool? And it's true. Like terrorists can use roads and the electricity grid and your open data. It's a serious question about what degree of control we're comfortable with. And when we keep talking about ownership or licensing or contracting, like these are all parts where I'm sure there are well-intentioned lawyers out there who can help and who have the common good in their heart. I know a few of them. But it is one of those spaces where a lot of very legally significant terms get thrown around. And so when we're talking about how is it that sort of public interest funding meets private sector investment, you have a very interesting legal problem. Because public sector funding has a whole different set of legal requirements than private market adoption, private market use. And I really do think that that is the core of one of the most interesting questions that this space faces as an industry and will continue to face over the course of probably a very long time, is how we balance at what point public funding can subsidize markets for distribution that result in private inurement or private benefit. But it is important to say, I think, that like the open space, that open is just open for everyone to control. And that we talk about that as a net good, and it may be, but it may not be. And it's just important to think about the situations. Like the partnership program you're talking about sounds really amazing for the governments that you trust, and really terrifying in places where there are governments that you may not trust. And it's balancing that can be really hard in a lot of spaces.
Let me stop, because I want to make sure we save time for questions, and we have a very full room. So if you're in the room, again, just raise your hand, we'll bring a mic. If you're online, just use hashtag innovation. We have one right here.
Yeah, hi, this is June Tellison from Housing Associates. I love the conversation, and especially liked earlier when Samia and others were talking about making sure that equipment that is bought can be used by others in the government. Because in a lot of countries, especially during Ebola, equipment or databases or ideas, things were bought for one purpose, and then they can't be used for other purposes. When the emergency is done, it should be able to be used by other parts of the government for other operations, because there's no need to buy new equipment for that. We need to figure out how we solve the logistics issues on that. And that is something I think that maybe needs to be put in USAID and contracts, or something that equipment bought for one purpose or one donor can be shared by other government agencies who are trying to make the government system work better. Why buy a separate tool for that? And then the other question, I agree, is I think when you're talking about where you focus open data, it's not necessarily that the laws are not in place, it's just that the government has no understanding about why this is so good. And so it needs a lot of capacity building on that front, but also capacity building on the people, on individuals. And I know that was a whole big problem in a lot of countries, and when they try to teach people how to use Open Data Freedom of Information Act, they just didn't know. They had no idea how to do these things, and that kind of capacity building needs to happen. But before that, as the digital dividends pointed out, we need more work on digital literacy, what the World Bank calls the analog components. We need to have that conversation before we can go on to these other conversations, because if we have that conversation first, the other conversations will be much easier about open data, because they'll have a background. Education will be, and so that's.
Thank you, and we'll go over here next for a question. I want to give maybe Vivian and Sean a chance to respond if you want.
Sure, I think to the first question on reuse of equipment, I think that's absolutely crucial. I think what I would push further is that it needs to go beyond a single agency, because in many cases what you're seeing is systems built around vertical disease silos. And so government facilities are collecting 38 different indicators on case counts for different diseases. It's 80% the same information, but none of those systems are built up for WHO, CDC, global health within USAID. And so there is a broader conversation that needs to happen, and back to the conversation on data standards too. I mean, what are we collecting over and over again?
I would just say that capacity building and governance are both best constructed when there's a clear idea of what the goal to be achieved is. I think that when we're talking about any technology or development infrastructure, if you can set a clear goal, you can reverse engineer a lot of the components that make that possible.
Actually, to answer a previous question about the low-hanging fruit, I forgot one, which was digital capacity needs to be put into basically every single capacity building project that's funded by a donor. I was involved in a project where there was a lot of capacity building of local NGOs, but USAID was refusing to pay for internet, and there was no digital capacity building of the local, but almost all of the materials that were being funded by USAID were online. So you had staff who didn't even know about these amazing materials that were being funded by USAID that were targeted directly to them because no one had bothered telling them about it. And then when you actually told them about it, they said, well, that's great, except for you don't have internet, I don't really know how to use the Excel. So that piece, we just can't put it online and assume everyone's going to use it. You have to actually go all the way down to the bottom, the place where people are actually supposed to be using these tools, and then figure out what the barriers are and remove them. It could be a laptop with antivirus software.
Hi, my name is Jenny Davis. I am an intern at Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and I'm also a graduate student at Duke University. So I want to thank the panel for your insight and your points of view when it comes to data for development. And I came a little bit late this morning, so I apologize if I missed this question. But when it comes to implementing data or any kind of technology in a project or a program, how do you make sure that it's that you can replicate it, and also if it's scalable in whatever context? It could be global health, it could be on agriculture, or any other sector.
But any two panelists respond.
Thank you for your question. A lot of this has to do at the very beginning with how you design that project, right? And then once you design the project, whether it's USAID, the World Bank, or any other, the way you put out the procurement document and what type of service providers you would have. And sometimes there are many, sometimes there are a few main ones with a lot of subs. To ensure success, and you may have missed that part, we kept talking about how we collaborate and we use stuff that has happened before. And if this was a meeting where we were all, let's say, Walmart representatives from around the world or Philips representatives, we would never have any of the discussion we had today. Because at the end of the day, it's all about, very simple in my view, sound, sustained, 20, 30-year long project management. And the point that Judith brought up, which is very, very simple, and again, another low-hanging fruit. What are the hardware assets the government has? Where are the servers? So many times, and I'm sure you all agree, or you've had the same thing, I walk into government offices and I see big boxes of servers that were shipped 2 or 3 years ago, some of them donated by IBM or Samsung, and never unwrapped. They're there, they're sitting there, and I bet you a few NGOs could use them, but nobody really knows how to start them and boot them and install them and configure them. So a lot of the points that you make around success of a project and scaling up have to do with sound design, using some of the principle of digital development that many agencies collaborated on a few years back, and the capacity to be able to scale and document what you have produced, which is also another thing where again, if you build it in the procurement of the hired contractors to document what they have produced.
So quick, sorry, just a really quick two-sentence answer to that is do a requirements analysis. Look at everything that thing requires to succeed, and then eliminate every single one of them that you can.
Yeah, I would just say to that also start with the user. I mean, most of the time, development initiatives, technology development initiatives are started with this great idea that someone in DC or London or wherever has, and it's actually, the idea is sitting thousands of miles away from where it's going to be implemented and is often built on assumptions. So if you start with the user and do some serious testing and understanding of the behaviors of the user and what they're even interested in, what they would be prepared to use, what they would want. If you have that research, you can can then sort of move to that, and you create your product or your service based on that. You can then move to the next location and start with the user research again, because obviously replication and scalability is fantastic, but we should never assume it, and it always needs to be contextualized. Until you understand the context and the life of the user, you're...
Thank you. Yes,
Hi,
it's on.
Okay, gotta work on my mic technique. I'm Ryan Levine from the International Center for Journalists. Question about following up on the statements about open data and open source. I mean, there are plenty of examples of use of open data and open source technology to drive private industry. The best example is probably what I call the private weather apps from private weather companies which use public open weather data. And even something like WebKit, which is the open source browser, which Apple, which as far as I know is not a nonprofit, is using to drive, their Apple browser. So I'm wondering if I want to hear your thoughts on whether it's possible to sort of take advantage of those sort of incentives to drive the sort of open data and open standards initiatives that everybody agrees we need.
Yeah, sorry, this is like one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'll be really quick. You and I can talk about this later. Weather data is open. The predictive models that make weather data useful are proprietary. And the companies that have developed the most sophisticated predictive models have categorically sold those models and their digital assets to private holders. The things that they have sold have been the predictive capacity, not the public-facing sort of public benefit element of that. So what open licensing of that data does is it pushes proprietary licensing downstream. And what it typically does is it intermediates a corporation, which is fine, like pro-business, I run a business, but it intermediates a corporation between that data and the end user. And so at some point, you're ending up looking at what are the commercial incentives. And we tend to think about this as like, is it going to rain tomorrow? But like, there are some really interesting questions that happens, like what happens when Panasonic, who right now supposedly has the world's most sophisticated weather prediction model, knows a week ahead of the US government that a hurricane's going to land on New Orleans? Like, is that public interest information? Is the fact that it came from public open data relevant to the reporting requirement to the US government? And at what point does the US government then have some need to look at their algorithm to understand whether or not it's actually sound? So there are a lot of really interesting questions, and it's one of those areas where public-private partnerships are being meted out, right? We're starting to test what those look like. But I wouldn't say that we have that weather data or the things that have happened as a result of them have been categorical wins for anyone other than like Monsanto or IBM.
And I would just add on to that the whole question about open source and open data is very, very complicated, because in addition to public sector usage of, for example, open data, you have a lot of examples of the private sector also offering some of their data for free. So as an example, we built an app for a tennis pro. We wanted to get a list of every single tennis court in the country. And so we ended up getting a subscription to Foursquare for free, but it's based on the number of downloads. So if you have over a certain amount, then you actually pay for it, and then under that. They do this because they know that the more people on Foursquare actually then gives them advertising revenue, and they make it as a free service to us. And it was great for us for what we needed. We ended up having every single tennis court in the country on our app for anyone who wanted them. So that's a great idea. We have all this great freeware, right? Facebook and Gmail and so forth, which none of which is open source. It's all free, but it's not open source. And there's the question of, you're not paying for it, who's actually the client? Open source also is a strategic decision. This is actually one area where I disagree with the digital principles. I don't think things should be open source by default. I think it needs to be based on the very specific context. Open source is fantastic in a lot of ways, and it's very strategically used. But proprietary software like Gmail, which is, by the way, used by USAID for its backbone email system, is not open source. So, there's definitely times and places for everything. And that's, again, where we get into this really interesting legal question about the government versus the private sector. Again, as we're becoming more and more reliant on, say, Google Maps for everyday, that's a public good-ish owned by a private sector company.
Yes, follow up, because I was trying to get to the idea that open doesn't mean open, it means there's open governance, but there's still governance. Depends, open source at least is open governance, depends on the open source model. There are 50 different open source licenses. We can talk about it.
So we have time for one more question. We'll go right here in the front row.
Hi, I'm a fellow and a graduate student as well, but my question is kind of going way back to where we started, which is, in your experiences, and maybe when you're on the ground, how do you actually talk to governments or groups who don't believe in the power of data? So everyone in this room, and you have surely proved yourselves that you're bought in. Data is going to help us down the line 20, 30 years in collecting information and then talking to policymakers. But I lived in Liberia during the Ebola outbreak, and you couldn't talk to anyone there about the power of numbers when they didn't have buckets of bleach to wash their hand, or they didn't have food, or a second bowl of rice, anything like that. So in emergency areas or war-torn countries currently in war or scarred by war, how do you interface with people who kind of scoff at your message that, no, these numbers actually matter? Because I think that's kind of the last mile problem, which is actually getting buy-in, educating the public, but I'm sure you've had experiences, or maybe the people who work for you or in past years have experiences doing this, so I'm just curious.
Great, thank you. We'll do, if everyone wants to respond, because it looks like everyone wants to, why don't we do very quick responses? And we can start.
Sure. I just want to say, when I was in Uganda, we were visiting district hospitals and health center 3 was the lowest level we went to. Health center 2 was kind of lowest. Every single place we went to, they used data. The data were hand-drawn maps and charts and so forth, and they desperately needed to know it for basic stuff like how many new mother kits are we going to need next month? Are we, out of rapid testing kits? But also just to be able to advocate and say, we did 40 C-sections last month and we have 2 doctors. And these are places where it was the middle of refugee camps, it was the middle of places that had very little, no electricity, very little internet. So I think it depends on who you're talking to, but anything that's predictive, data is power. And once you show people the power of the data, then, oh, absolutely. I find it very easy to convince people.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that. I don't think I have anything to tell you that you don't already know, but, find your champion. There's going to be someone who, in government, you always need a champion. And start small and prove, demonstrate success on something small within government or a ministry. And I mean, I think it's unsurprising that during Ebola, people were probably not very responsive.
Find the right context. Everyone has priorities, and you can represent those priorities in data and make that relationship very, very articulable. So you can say, what are the things that you care about accomplishing? Let's show you how many of them you accomplish. And then let's talk about what are the things that factor into your ability to accomplish it. And pretty soon you're building a schematic for their ability to understand their system as represented in data. The context there matters. I would say that in the Liberian context in particular, it's hard when you're in an emergency to get anybody to spend the time to do work the right way. And there's an old Abraham Lincoln quote, which is, you give me 6 hours to cut down a tree, I'm gonna spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. As it turns out, that's not usually how disaster response works. And maybe probably not how it should work, but it's important to find the context that aligns everything you do, not just digitization, around what are the goals you're trying to achieve. And I think that when you can articulate those in a common language, it's a lot easier to align incentives for different parties.
A facetious answer, find a champion and talk to his or her kids. It's not the real thing. Everybody said it, find a champion, show that champion or that coalition of champions how data would make them look good to the constituents. Typically, where we've had the most success, and I'll be very brief, is open data for traffic, showing where you have the most accidents. It's really a public good, right? So safety, security, show them how it would make them look good.
All really good thoughts. You talked about two different levels, at the government level and then at that last mile level. And I think that context absolutely matters. At the government level, you're talking about different incentives, and so you do have to find your champions, find the people, and find the ways that speak to them. That holds true at the last mile level as well. Maybe you don't talk about data. Maybe you do look at the immediate situation on hand and figure out a way in which it can be demonstrated with the value. And I think that is what bridges the two, is create value, whatever value means to that person, and then make sure that those two sides from government to last mile are connected and able to engage. And that's the way that we sustainably prove that data has a value outside of what USAID or any other donor is going to be funding.
Great. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for your participation today and your questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists for that.